The Letter That Crossed Time, Chapter 1, The Return Morning in Charleston, May 2025. The air, thick with the scent of jasmine and salt, carried the distant cry of gulls. I, Sarah, was 62 now. The Victorian house, with its rambling porch and sleepy shutters, had been my home for decades. My childhood home, the place where joy, laughter, and ultimately a profound, lingering sadness had woven themselves into the very fabric of its walls. My father, Richard, he'd vanished, poof, just like that, in 1981. After a monumental fight, a chasm opened between us, raw and ugly, and then he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation. Just a hollow space where a brilliant, complicated man used to be. For 44 years, his disappearance had been a ghost in every room, a question mark hovering over every memory. The postman's familiar whistle cut through the morning quiet. He handed me a package. It was flat, slightly oversized, wrapped in plain brown paper. The return address was unfamiliar, a P.O. box in Key West, Florida. My brow furrowed. I didn't know anyone there. I carried it inside, the weight of it surprisingly heavy in my hands. I tore open the paper. Inside, a large, yellowed envelope. And then, my breath caught. My own handwriting, clear, bold, young. It was my letter, the one I'd written to Dad in 1981. My letter to Richard. My heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew this letter. Every word, every desperate plea, every stinging accusation. I had written it in a fit of rage and regret, just days after our last terrible argument. I had never sent it. I was too proud, too hurt. It had sat on my desk, then in a box, then in an attic trunk, a silent testament to a bridge burned. But this was different. The envelope was sealed, but not by me. There was a faint, almost transparent tape along the flap, and across the front, in elegant, unfamiliar script, a notation. Opened, Elizabeth. Elizabeth? Who was Elizabeth? My fingers trembled as I tore open the envelope. The paper inside was crisp, crackling with age. My own words, written in a fury, stared back at me. I barely registered them. My eyes were drawn to the new, unfamiliar sheet of paper tucked inside, folded neatly, written in a graceful, older hand. I pulled it out, my vision blurred. "Dear Sarah," it began. "Not from Dad, from Elizabeth. He always remembered. He loved you, more than you know. He kept your letter. He never forgot." The words hit me like a physical blow. He loved you. He never forgot. This was a message from beyond the grave, from someone who knew my father, knew him, knew us. My hands shook so violently I almost dropped the letter. My father, Richard, the man who had vanished, the man I had grieved, resented, loved, and never understood. He had kept my letter. He had loved me. Someone, this Elizabeth, was telling me this. 44 years later, who was Elizabeth? How did she have my unsent letter? What did she know? And what did she mean? He always remembered. The silence of the house pressed in around me. The ghost of my father, for the first time in decades, felt less like a specter of absence and more like a presence with a story, a truth. And I, Sarah, was desperate to hear it. The letter that had crossed time had just ripped open an old wound, and with it, a desperate, undeniable need for answers. Chapter 2, The Echoes of 81. The letter from Elizabeth lay on my kitchen table, a beacon in the swirling fog of my confusion. I read it again and again, each word a tiny pinprick of hope, and a fresh wave of questions. The postmark on the outer package was recent, May 2025. The return address was a P.O. box in Key West. Nothing else. No phone number, no full name. Just Elizabeth. I examined my old letter, the one I'd written. The paper was slightly brittle, the ink surprisingly vibrant. My 18-year-old self, raw and furious, spilled out onto the page. Accusations of neglect, of prioritizing his dusty history books over his own daughter. My desperate need for his attention, my plea for him to stay. Our fight had been terrible. A typical teenage rebellion, escalated by my father's quiet, impenetrable distance. He was a professor of history, a brilliant man, but often lost in the past. He'd announced he was leaving Charleston for a research project, vague and secretive. Just for a few months, he said. I saw it as abandonment. I lashed out. He retreated. And then he simply left and never came back. No phone calls, no letters, nothing. The police searches faded. The missing person reports went cold. He was just gone. My mother, bless her soul, had wasted away from grief and worry. She died 5 years later, never knowing what became of her beloved Richard. I carried the guilt of our last fight, the bitterness of his departure, like a heavy stone in my heart. Now this letter. He always remembered. He loved you. A lifeline thrown across 44 years. My journalistic instincts, dormant for years, sparked to life. I needed to find Elizabeth. The P.O. box was the only clue. But Key West was a long way from Charleston. I needed to talk to someone who remembered that time, someone who knew my father well. Martha. Martha Jenkins, my parents' oldest friend, our neighbor for decades. She lived just 2 houses down, her memory as sharp as ever, even at 88. I walked over. The Charleston sun warm on my face. Martha was on her porch, tending to her geraniums. Her eyes, still sparkling behind her glasses, crinkled as she saw me. "Sarah, dear, what brings you out in this heat?" I sat beside her, the letter clutched in my hand. "Martha, I need to ask you something about Dad. About 1981. Her smile faded. Her eyes took on that distant, knowing look of someone recalling a painful memory. Ah, Richard. Such a good man. So quiet. So troubled in those last days. I showed her the letter, my old one, and Elizabeth's reply. Martha's hand, gnarled with age, trembled as she read Elizabeth's words. My goodness. My goodness. She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. So he didn't just disappear. He was somewhere. And he loved you, dear. I always knew he did. Did you ever see him after he left, Martha? Did he ever contact you? I pressed. She shook her head slowly. No, never. But I remember that fight. Oh, Sarah, you two were so alike, both so stubborn, both so proud. He was heartbroken, you know, even though he didn't show it. He loved you fiercely. He told me once, just before he left, that he felt he was failing you, that he needed to find himself again, to finish something, a project. He was so vague. A project. That word again. My father always had a project. Something buried in history. Something to lose himself in. Did he ever mention Key West? Florida? I asked. A desperate hope blooming. Martha squinted, thinking. Key West? No. He always spoke of the archives. He had some distant relative in Florida, I think. But Key West, no, not to me. He was so private, Martha. I sighed, staring out at the sun-dappled street. Always, even with his family, even with you. Yes, she agreed, her voice soft. A man of many layers, your father, and he carried a lot of sadness. Always. She squeezed my hand. You must find this Elizabeth, dear. She has answers. And you deserve to know. The words echoed in my heart. I deserve to know. After all these years, the universe had finally decided to give me a chance. The P.O. box in Key West was a thin thread, but it was all I had. And I would follow it, to the end of the earth if I had to. Chapter 3. The trail to the southernmost point. The Key West P.O. box was a dead end. A rented box, nothing more. No name attached, no physical address. Just a post office that processed thousands of letters. My journalist's instinct told me I needed more. A name, a face. I pulled out all of Dad's old boxes from the attic. Years of accumulated paper, books, and forgotten treasures. I was searching for anything that might link him to Key West. Old research notes, letters, photos, anything. Days turned into a relentless hunt. My hands became stained with dust and old paper. The house smelled of forgotten history. I found his old academic journals, his meticulously detailed research on the Civil War, his notes on forgotten Southern figures. Nothing that screamed Key West. Then, buried deep beneath a pile of old maps, I found it. A small, leather-bound notebook. Not a diary, but a project book. Dated 1980 to 1981. His careful script filled the pages, outlining a new historical research project. The subject, Maritime History of the Florida Keys. My heart leaped. And on the first page, almost hidden, was an address. 1421 Ocean Breeze Lane, Key West, Florida. Below it, scrawled in pencil, small cottage, near lighthouse. A small cottage near the lighthouse. This was it. This had to be it. His last known address. The place he went after he left Charleston. My resolve hardened. I had to go. I had to see this place. To touch the ground where he spent his final years. To find this Elizabeth. To finally get answers. The drive was long. The landscape slowly transforming from the familiar South Carolina pines to the tropical, vibrant flora of Florida. The air grew humid, salty, and thick with the scent of oleander and frangipani. As I crossed the overseas highway, the ocean stretched out endlessly on either side, a shimmering expanse of turquoise and emerald. Key West. It was everything I imagined and nothing I expected. A vibrant, colorful tapestry of old architecture, eccentric art, and the omnipresent feel of the sea. It felt like a world away from the quiet, dignified streets of Charleston. 1421 Ocean Breeze Lane. I found it. It was a small, dilapidated cottage, tucked away down a narrow lane, its paint peeling, its porch overgrown with bougainvillea. It stood just as the notebook described, a stone's throw from the iconic Key West lighthouse, its white beacon piercing the brilliant blue sky. My heart ached as I stood there. This was his last home. This was where he lived, where he breathed, where he died. The unanswered questions were a physical weight in my chest. The house was clearly empty, abandoned. I knocked on the doors of the neighboring cottages. An elderly woman, her skin tanned and creased from years in the sun, answered the door next door. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yes," I began, my voice trembling slightly. I'm looking for information about the man who lived in the cottage next door. Richard Holloway. He was a professor. Her eyes widened slightly. Oh, Professor Holloway, a quiet man, kept to himself. He passed away some years ago. A shame. Always had his nose in a book or looking out at the sea. Do you know when he passed? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Let me see. Must have been maybe 7, 8 years ago now. He was quite ill towards the end. A kind woman, a caregiver, looked after him. Elizabeth, I think her name was. Elizabeth, a caregiver. My heart soared with a strange mix of relief and renewed anguish. He had been cared for. He hadn't been alone. Do you know where she went? Or if she has a family? I pressed, hoping against hope. The neighbor shook her head. No, dear. She just left after he passed. I think she was just a local helper. She picked up his mail at the P.O. box sometimes. A P.O. box, yes, that's right. She pointed vaguely down the street, down at the main post office. My head snapped up. The P.O. box. The return address on Elizabeth's letter. It had to be the same one. She hadn't left me a dead end. She had left me a message in a bottle, waiting to be found. I thanked the neighbor, my mind racing. I went directly to the post office. It was a bustling place. I found the section for P.O. boxes. Box 273, the one on the envelope. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just knock on a P.O. box. But I had to leave a message, a sign, a plea. I took out a small notepad and a pen. I wrote my name, my phone number, and one simple sentence. I received your letter. Please call me Sarah. I folded the note, slipped it through the narrow slot of box 273. It felt like dropping a message into the vast, indifferent ocean. But this ocean, this time, was delivering, a sense of profound hope and dread twisting in my gut. The ball was in Elizabeth's court. Now all I could do was wait. Again. Chapter 4. The Voice on the Line. The next few days in Key West were a blur of nervous anticipation. I stayed at a small guest house, trying to distract myself with the vibrant energy of the town. But my phone remained my constant companion. A silent oracle, every ring, every notification, sent a jolt through me. Then, 3 days after I left my message, it rang, an unfamiliar number, a Key West area code. My heart leaped into my throat. I answered, my voice a little shaky. Hello? Is this Sarah Holloway? A man's voice, young, respectful, not Elizabeth. Yes, I managed. Who is this? My name is David, he said. David Miller. My mother, she asked me to call you. My mother is Elizabeth. My breath hitched. Elizabeth? I repeated, almost a whisper. You found my note? Yes, David confirmed. She was just checking the P.O. box. She was very surprised and a little overwhelmed. She asked me to call you. She's not very good with phones. Overwhelmed? I asked, a mix of curiosity and impatience stirring within me. Why? And how? How did she have my father's letter? David paused. His voice softened. Sarah, my mother was Professor Holloway's caregiver in his final years. They were very close. He was like family to us. She found your letter among his most cherished possessions after he passed away. A caregiver. So he hadn't been alone. A wave of relief, profound and unexpected, washed over me. He'd had someone. He never forgot you, Sarah, David continued, his voice gentle. He spoke of you constantly, about the fight, about how much he regretted it, how much he loved you. My mother, she saw his pain, his lifelong sorrow. When she found your letter, she felt compelled to answer, to give you some peace. Tears streamed down my face. It was a word I hadn't dared to dream of for decades. Can I speak to her? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Can I meet her? David agreed. She'd like that very much, Sarah. She's not well. She's had some health issues recently, but she wants to meet you. She says you deserve to know everything. We arranged to meet the next day at Elizabeth's home, a modest little house nestled in a quiet, leafy street, not far from the cottage where my father had lived. The Key West sun filtered through the palm trees, casting dappled shadows on the porch. I arrived, my heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and a deep, urgent need for resolution. David met me at the door. He was a kind-faced man in his late 30s, with gentle eyes that reminded me, vaguely, of my father's. She's in the living room, Sarah, he said, leading me inside. She's very excited to see you. Elizabeth was sitting in an armchair, frail but with an undeniable strength in her gaze. Her hair was silver, pulled back neatly. Her eyes, though tired, were clear and kind. She looked up as I entered, a faint smile gracing her lips. Sarah, she whispered, her voice soft but surprisingly steady. Thank you for coming. I sat opposite her, my hands clasped in my lap. The silence between us was filled with unspoken history, with decades of unanswered questions. You knew my father, I began, my voice barely audible. Yes, Elizabeth confirmed, her gaze distant, as if recalling long-ago memories. He was a good man, Sarah. A very good man, and he loved you deeply, more than you could ever imagine. And then she began to tell me the story of my father's last years, the story of a secret love and a lifelong regret. The truth finally began to unfold. Chapter 5, the unwritten chapter. Elizabeth's voice, though soft, was clear and unwavering as she began to paint a picture of my father's life in Key West. He had arrived in 1981, not for a fleeting research project, but for a permanent move. He was, she explained, heartbroken. Broken by our argument, by what he perceived as his failure as a father, and by a sense of deep weariness that had settled over him long before he left Charleston. He came here seeking solitude, Elizabeth explained, her eyes fixed on some distant point. He told me he needed to disappear, to mend himself. He bought that small cottage. It was run down, but he loved the quiet, the proximity to the sea. He found work, piecemeal, writing and editing for a local historical society, enough to live simply. Elizabeth had met him through her son, David, who did odd jobs around the neighborhood. Richard, my father, was a recluse, but he had taken a liking to David, who was then a young boy. Elizabeth, a widow struggling to make ends meet, had offered to help him with his housekeeping, then later, as his health declined, became his primary caregiver. He was so proud, Sarah, she said, a sad smile touching her lips. He never wanted anyone to know how much he struggled. He was frail, especially in his later years. A heart condition, they said, but his mind was always sharp, always brilliant. He never remarried. He lived a quiet, solitary life. His only constant companions were his books, the ocean, and, in his final years, Elizabeth and David. He spoke of you constantly, Elizabeth continued, her voice filled with tenderness. Every day, it seemed, about your brilliance, your spirit, the fire you had. He often said he wished he'd handled your argument differently. He carried that regret like a heavy burden. My father, Richard, the man I thought was cold, distant, aloof. He had carried my burden, our burden, the guilt I had lived with for 44 years. And your letter, Sarah, Elizabeth said, her eyes meeting mine. He found it. That very day he left Charleston. It had been misplaced in a stack of outgoing mail. He packed it with him, unopened. He kept it with him. He said he couldn't bring himself to read it. Not yet. Not until he was ready. He carried it from Charleston to Key West. It was the only thing he took with him from your home. My letter, the one I thought I'd never sent. He had had it all along, unread, because he was afraid of the raw emotion, afraid of facing his own pain, afraid of confronting the words of his angry, heartbroken daughter. He eventually read it, Sarah, Elizabeth assured me, her voice gentle. Years later, after he had settled here, he cried for days. He kept it with him, always. He would pull it out sometimes, late at night, and just look at your handwriting. It was a tangible link to you, a constant reminder of the daughter he loved more than life itself. She rose slowly, with David's help, and walked to a small antique desk in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of leather-bound journals. These are his, she said, placing them gently on the coffee table in front of me. His private thoughts. He kept them hidden. He said no one should ever read them. But after he passed, I knew you deserved to. He wrote about you, Sarah, about his love for you, his sorrow, his regrets, and his hope that one day you would understand. I opened the first journal. The pages were filled with my father's familiar, elegant script. Dates, places, research notes, and then abruptly, amidst the historical facts, my name, followed by lines of raw, unadulterated emotion. Sarah, he wrote on a page dated 1983. My dearest Sarah, the silence is deafening. I see you in every sunset over the water. I hear your laughter in the wind. I made a terrible mistake. I should have stayed. I should have fought for you. My pride, my foolish pride, it has cost me everything. Further on, dated 1990, I read her letter again today. Her pain, her anger. She was right. I was distant, lost in my own world. My dearest girl, if only I could go back. If only I could tell her how much I truly loved her, how much I still do. And then a page dated just a few months before his death in 2017. The letter, her letter, it is my only comfort, my last tangible link to her. I failed her, but I never stopped loving her. Never. I hope, I pray, she finds peace, that she knows, that she understands. Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast. This was him, unfiltered, raw. The words were a salve on a 44-year-old wound. He had loved me. He had suffered. He had regretted. He had grieved. Just like me. Chapter 6. The post office's unintended compass. But how did my letter, how did it get back to me in 2025? I asked, my voice still thick with emotion. It was never mailed. David, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. That's where I come in, Sarah. My mother is right. Your father found your letter and kept it. He never mailed it. He couldn't. It was too personal, too painful. After he passed, David continued, my mother was going through his things. She found your letter. Hidden in his old desk, along with his journals, she remembered how much he spoke of you, how much he loved you, how he wished you knew. She saw your return address on the envelope, faded, but still legible. She felt a strong need to send it to you, Elizabeth interjected, her eyes meeting mine. For him, for you, to bring you closure, to tell you he loved you. But she was frail. David picked up the story, and not well, so she asked me to send it. I took it to the post office. It was a local post office box that she rented for some of his affairs. I put your letter, along with her note, into a larger envelope addressed to you, using your old return address. But that's it, I said, confused. That's the exact address that was on my original letter. Why did it take 44 years to get back? David smiled, a wry, understanding grin. That's the odd part, Sarah. A post office anomaly. When I sent your letter back to you, I used your original return address, the one from 1981, as the destination. But that address was also the original destination of your father's P.O. box back in 1981, where he initially received mail for his research before he fully settled here. The post office system sometimes flags old, uncollected, or misdelivered mail. Back in 1981, when your letter was mistakenly bundled with his outgoing mail, and he took it with him. The system likely still had a record of that specific P.O. box at the old Key West post office as an active forwarding address for him, even though it was rarely used. So when he closed the P.O. box shortly before he passed, any mail that came to him, even decades later, would have been systematically returned to the sender. This would have happened whether it was physical mail or a ghost in the system still marking it as a returned item. It must have been a clerical error back in 1981, David explained. Your letter was never properly processed as sent to him from Charleston. It got caught in some internal loop. When my mother asked me to mail it back to you in 2025, using your original return address, the system saw it as a new outgoing mail piece from Key West. But because your original letter had been mysteriously tagged in the system as undeliverable to original recipient, way back in 1981, with your Charleston address as the original sender, it finally processed the return. Essentially, the letter you thought you didn't send, but your father did carry, was finally, after decades, returned to you, the sender, by the postal system, just as if it had been lost in transit all these years. It was a bureaucratic miracle, a cosmic accident. The post office, in its own slow, methodical way, had finally completed a delivery initiated over 4 decades ago. It had taken a letter, lost in the shadows of a broken family, and transformed it into a beacon of truth. So it truly was lost in time, I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief, and found again. By fate, Elizabeth added, her eyes gleaming with conviction, and by love. Chapter 7, A Full Circle. My time with Elizabeth and David was a revelation. We talked for hours, days even, sharing stories, piecing together the life of the man I thought I knew, and the man I was only just beginning to understand. I learned about his quiet dignity, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, his struggles with loneliness, and his enduring profound love for me. The old journals became my comfort. I read them voraciously, devouring every word, every painful confession, every unexpressed sentiment. They were a window into his soul, a final, intimate conversation between a father and a daughter, separated by time, but connected by an unbreakable bond. He had never stopped thinking of me, never stopped loving me, never stopped regretting the way things ended. He had been a man of immense pride, yes, but also of immense pain. And in his quiet solitude, in that small cottage by the sea, he had carried my letter and my memory as his most precious possessions. I realized that my anger, my resentment, had been fueled by a lack of understanding, by a void that only now, with Elizabeth's courage and David's help, was being filled. He hadn't abandoned me out of indifference. He had retreated into his own grief, his own shame. Unable to face the raw emotion of our final confrontation. And he had protected himself, and in his own way, me, from more pain. The scar that had festered in my heart for 44 years began to heal. The bitterness dissolved, replaced by a deep, tender sorrow for his suffering, and an overwhelming sense of peace. He had loved me. He had always loved me. The knowledge was a balm. Before I left Key West, I visited his grave. It was a simple, unmarked plot in a quiet cemetery, tucked away beneath the shade of a magnificent banyan tree. David had taken care of the arrangements. I placed a small, polished shell on the headstone, a symbol of the sea he loved and the journey he had taken. "I love you, Dad," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "And I forgive you, and I understand." I felt his presence then, not as a ghost of absence, but as a warm, comforting embrace. The weight lifted, the burden was gone. I returned to Charleston a changed woman. The house, once filled with the echoes of loss, now held a new, quiet sense of peace. The old Victorian walls, once silent witnesses to a broken family, now hummed with the rediscovered truth of enduring love. I stayed in touch with Elizabeth and David. They became my new family, connected by the man we all loved, each in our own way. Elizabeth, frail but resilient, was a living testament to my father's final years, a keeper of his quiet story. And David, her kind son, was the messenger who had finally delivered the truth across time. The letter I had written in 1981, never sent, yet always carried, had finally found its way home. It wasn't a mere piece of paper. It was a bridge built across decades, a testament to enduring love, forgiveness, and the incredible, often mysterious ways in which life's deepest truths finally find their way to us, offering healing and a profound sense of peace. My father's secret was out, and it had, at last, set us all free.